Saturday mornings had a special kind of magic for 90s kids, and for a lot of us, that magic came with Spider-Man, the animated series. This show felt like the comics had leapt right off the page and onto the screen. We have so many good memories watching this with our friends and brothers and cousins, and we're sure you probably have some of those as well, and that's why today we're bringing you 30 insane facts about Spider-Man, the animated series that made this show unforgettable. Before we get into our explanation, we have a very small request. If you like our content, please support us by subscribing to our channel. This is a small click for you, but for us, it means a lot. Thank you. Let's begin. Which rock legend performed the show's unforgettable theme song? The very first thing anyone remembers about Spider-Man the Animated Series is that wild guitar-driven theme. The distorted vocals chanting his name over a riff that felt ripped straight out of a rock concert made Spider-Man sound cooler than ever. The man responsible was Joe Perry, the guitarist for Aerosmith. Having a rock star handle the theme music gave the show an edge that no other superhero cartoon had at the time. Producer Avi Arad and the team at Saban wanted something modern, something that would stand apart from the orchestral scores of Batman and Superman. Perry's electric guitar work did exactly that. He recorded the theme in the early 90s, layering experimental effects over the riffs to give it that futuristic vibe. Kids who tuned in every Saturday morning were watching their friendly neighborhood wall crawler hyped up by the same guitarist who played Walk This Way. Even now, if you ask fans to hum a Spider-Man theme, a lot of them will instinctively belt out Perry's grungy take. It captured the spirit of the 90s Spider-Man perfectly.
Spider-Man? But you're a little late for Halloween. Name's Hobgoblin, and you're right on time.
Which Star Wars icon lent his voice to a Spider-Man villain? Spider-Man, the animated series, had a stacked voice cast, but one name leaps out when you look back at the credits. Mark Hamill, Mr. Luke Skywalker himself, took on the role of the Hobgoblin. At that point in the mid-90s, Hamill was carving out a second career in voice acting, but this was one of the roles that proved just how good he was at bringing animated villains to life. Hobgoblin was introduced early in the series, before even the Green Goblin showed up, which gave Hamill the chance to set the tone for Spider-Man's goblin enemies on screen. His Hobgoblin voice was sharp and menacing, but there was also a manic energy that hinted at what he'd later do with the Joker in Batman the Animated Series. Fans who watched the show at the time might not have realized it was Hamill under the mask, but looking back, it's easy to see the DNA of his later performances in those episodes. For many, this was the first time they saw him as more than Luke, and it quietly kicked off his legendary run as one of the greatest voice actors in animation.
The cries of the Night Stalker are like music to my ear.
Which comic villain appeared on TV years before making it to the movies? Before Wesley Snipes made Blade a box office hit, the character's first on-screen appearance was in Spider-Man, the animated series. In a 1995 storyline where Spider-Man is up against Morbius, Blade appears as a supporting hero determined to wipe out vampires. For kids who had never picked up the Tomb of Dracula comics, this was their introduction to the half-human, half-vampire hunter. The series gave Blade a slick redesign with high-tech armor and gadgets that looked right at home in a 90s cartoon. He even came packaged with an original character named Whistler, a grizzled mentor figure who would later be adapted directly into the Blade movies. This means the version of Whistler that fans know from live action started right here in Spider-Man's animated world. Blade wasn't a household name in the 90s, yet the writers found a way to weave him into Spider-Man's web naturally. When the Blade film hit theaters in 1998, kids who grew up on the cartoon already knew exactly who he was. Why did Spider-Man's Rogues Gallery debut in a surprising order? If you think about Spider-Man villains, Green Goblin usually takes center stage. He's Peter Parker's ultimate nemesis in the comics, the guy who changes his life forever. Or maybe Dr. Octopus comes to your mind, since both his and Spider-Man's origin stories kind of started off together. But in the animated series, it was the Hobgoblin who appeared first. That decision confused a lot of fans, and it wasn't because the writers didn't know their stuff, it came down to executives and toy shelves. At the time, Hobgoblin was riding high in Marvel Comics and was considered more marketable for kids' merchandise. Studio heads thought that a Hobgoblin action figure would sell better than Green Goblin, so they pushed to get him on screen early. The writing team had already developed a detailed plan for Norman Osborn, but they had to shuffle things around to satisfy network demands. The result is a bit of an oddity in Spider-Man history. Kids who grew up on the cartoon met Hobgoblin first and might have assumed he was Spider-Man's big archenemy. By the time Green Goblin finally entered the story, the groundwork felt different than the comics, but still gave the show a unique identity.
It is time to take our leave.
Which iconic Spidey villains were banned from appearing on the show? Spider-Man the animated series had no shortage of villains, but two big names were completely off the table: Sandman and Electro. Not because the writers didn't want them, mind you, but they were told they couldn't use them. Around that time, James Cameron himself was developing a live-action Spider-Man movie, and the studio wanted to keep certain characters reserved exclusively for him. This left the cartoon staff in a bind. They had already written ideas involving Electro and Sandman, but all of it had to be scrapped. As a workaround, the show leaned harder into other villains like Shocker, who ended up filling the electric-powered baddie slot. Electro himself eventually showed up later in the series, but his origin was changed drastically because of these restrictions. For longtime Spider-Man fans, it was strange to see such essential rogues missing in action. Still, the limitation forced the writers to get creative and highlight lesser-used villains, giving the show a flavor that set it apart from the comics. And Cameron's Spider-Man never even got made, so all of that was actually for nothing.
He is no longer my son. Now you may call him...
Why did one major villain get rewritten with a brand new backstory? Electro's eventual appearance in the show turned out very different from the comic books. Instead of being Max Dillon, the unlucky electrician struck by lightning, the series made him Reinhold Kregov, a Russian scientist who was revealed to be the Red Skull's son. This drastic change came directly from restrictions placed on the writers. Since the original Electro was tied up with movie rights, they had to invent a new version that could fit into the show's universe without conflicting with other projects. The result was a villain who looked the part but carried a backstory that tied him to Marvel's larger legacy of Hydra and World War II. It wasn't the most popular change among comic fans, but it added a new layer to the animated series. By connecting Electro to Red Skull, the show gave Spider-Man a villain with a different kind of weight. Someone rooted in Marvel's broader history rather than just street-level crime. It's a perfect example of how the series bent the rules to keep things fresh, while outside forces got in the way. The first appearance of animated Daredevil. In Season 3, Matt Murdock shows up as Peter Parker's lawyer when Spidey is accused of crimes he didn't commit. What made it even cooler is that it gave us full-on Daredevil in action. The writers leaned into his blind but heightened senses fighting style, something pretty bold for a 90s kids cartoon. For many fans, this was their introduction to the man without fear, long before he had his own spotlight. It also set a precedent for the series being Marvel's testing ground for heroes outside Spidey's immediate circle. Spidey's first animated team-up with the X-Men. Long before the X-Men movies kicked off in 2000, fans got to see Spider-Man cross paths with Marvel's mutants thanks to Spider-Man the Animated Series. In the Season 2 episode, Mutant Agenda, Peter Parker travels to Xavier's school for gifted youngsters, hoping Professor X can help cure his mutation. Instead, he finds himself caught between the X-Men and the villainous beast hunter, Herbert Landon. This crossover was a big deal because the X-Men were given the same character designs, voices, and continuity from X-Men the Animated Series, creating one of the first examples of a shared Marvel cartoon universe. It was mind-blowing at the time and gave fans a taste of the kind of interconnected storytelling that the MCU would later perfect. The Avengers assembled before the MCU. It might surprise some people, but Spider-Man actually fought alongside the Avengers in animation way before Robert Downey Jr. ever donned the Iron Man suit. In Season 5 of Spider-Man the Animated Series, during the Secret Wars storyline, Spidey is chosen by the Cosmic Beyonder to lead Earth's greatest heroes against villains on a distant planet. His team included Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, the Fantastic Four's Thing, and even the X-Men Storm. For kids in the 90s, this was the first time they ever saw so many Marvel heavyweights sharing the screen, decades before the Avengers films made it mainstream. It showed just how ambitious the animated series was in pushing Marvel's interconnected universe forward, even when Hollywood wasn't ready to.
Uh-oh! Chow time!
Who designed Spider-Man's iconic suit for TV? Fans might think Spider-Man's classic red and blue suit was easy to animate, but translating it from comics to television in the 90s was a real challenge. The team at Marvel and Saban leaned on the work of legendary comic artist John Romita, but they had to make tweaks for animation. The goal was to create a suit that would move fluidly during Spider-Man's wall-crawling and swinging scenes while keeping it instantly recognizable. Animators added subtle shading and clean lines so Peter's movements didn't get lost in the visuals. Every punch, flip, and web swing had to read clearly on a small TV screen. Interestingly, these design choices influenced other adaptations. Later, video games and cartoons often borrowed from the 90s TV design rather than the original comics. Fans often overlook how much work went into making Spider-Man look natural on screen. Beyond just aesthetics, the suit's design also helped convey emotion. Tiny shifts in posture or hand gestures could communicate Peter's mood, something the team considered carefully. That's why, even decades later, this animated version of Spider-Man still looks iconic and instantly familiar to fans of all ages. Why was the show known for its mature themes? Spider-Man, the animated series, stood out because it wasn't just a fun superhero cartoon. Even though it aired on Saturday mornings, the writers didn't shy away from serious, sometimes dark themes. Storylines like Neogenic Nightmare and the Alien Costume explored hard-hitting things like identity, personal responsibility, and the consequences of power. Villains weren't just evil for the sake of being cruel, they had complex backstories and motivations that made them relatable and occasionally even sympathetic. Morbius, the living vampire, and the Hobgoblin were given personal stakes that went beyond simple fight-the-hero plots. Episodes often showed the real-life repercussions of Peter Parker's choices, which added weight to the action and drama. This storytelling approach appealed to older viewers while still captivating kids, creating a unique balance that most cartoons at the time didn't achieve. Even today, fans talk about how these arcs stuck with them, shaping their understanding of Spider-Man as a hero who has to juggle responsibility and relationships. Which minor character got an unexpected cameo across multiple episodes? One of the coolest things about Spider-Man the Animated Series was how even the background characters felt like they had lives of their own. Take Lonnie Lincoln, later known as the gangster Tombstone. He wasn't introduced with fanfare or a big storyline. In fact, he first appeared as a generic thug in one of the early gang episodes, but the animators and writers clearly liked him because he kept popping up in the background or as a secondary antagonist in later episodes. His bald head, dark suit, and imposing frame made him stand out. Even in silent moments, he had this quiet, almost intimidating presence. Kids who watched the show might not have noticed at first, but on rewatching, you can spot him leaning against a wall, lurking in a crowd, or following orders with a stoic glare. This subtle continuity gave fans the sense that Spider-Man's world had depth, that New York's criminal underworld wasn't a series of isolated villains, but an interconnected web of people and events. Tombstone's recurring appearances may have been small, but they added texture and realism to the show, and a treat for eagle-eyed viewers who appreciated how the series respected even its minor characters. Who really designed Spider-Man's looks and animation for the series? A lot of fans assume that Spider-Man's animated design in the series was based on Nicholas Hammond from the live-action Amazing Spider-Man show, but that's not the case. The truth goes back to Stan Lee himself. He wanted the series to feel fresh and contemporary, with Peter Parker as a college-aged hero rather than a high school kid. Lee personally passed on detailed notes to producer Bob Richardson, who then took the reins and drew the character from scratch. Designing Peter Parker for animation wasn't easy. Richardson later admitted that the initial concept went through multiple revisions because they wanted a look that could work in action sequences while still feeling modern and relatable. In the early episodes, Peter's civilian wardrobe leaned on simple striped t-shirts, which gave him a very teenage, almost generic feel. By the second season, the animators had upgraded him with more stylish, layered outfits, reflecting the college-aged contemporary Peter Parker that Stan Lee had envisioned. Even Spider-Man's suit got tweaks, sharper lines and sleeker proportions that made it feel more dynamic on screen. These small design changes helped the character feel alive, believable, and ready to swing through a New York that looked just as real as he did.
I never want to see him again.
Who was the first African American to play Kingpin? When Michael Clark Duncan was cast as Wilson Fisk in 2003's Daredevil, it made headlines because he was seen as the first African American to take on the role of the traditionally white comic book villain. But the real first came years earlier in animation. Roscoe Lee Brown, a legendary actor and voice artist, actually voiced Kingpin in Spider-Man the Animated Series, making him the first African-American to bring the character to life. Brown was already a seasoned performer with a rich, commanding voice that made him perfect for a character like Fisk. Even in a kid's cartoon, he could convey both menace and intelligence, making Kingpin feel more than just a giant crime boss in a red and white suit. Episodes featuring him often showed the delicate balance between his brutal power and strategic mind, and Brown's delivery elevated every scene he was in. He would continue his illustrious career for decades, lending his voice and presence to projects ranging from Babe to Freakazoid. Sadly, Brown passed away in 2007 at the age of 84. But for fans of the animated Spider-Man, his performance remains iconic, a masterclass in how a voice can define a character long before live-action adaptations ever come into play. Why was the Sinister Six renamed on the show? If you grew up watching Spider-Man the Animated Series, you might remember a formidable group of villains teaming up to take down the Web-Slinger. But in the show, they weren't called the Sinister Six, they went by the Insidious Six. It wasn't a creative choice or a clever rebranding by the writers, it came straight from the censors at Fox Kids. Apparently, the word sinister was deemed a little too scary for a children's cartoon, even though other shows, like X-Men the Animated Series, used Mr. Sinister without issue. Beyond the name change, the team itself was tweaked. Dr. Octopus and Mysterio were still present, but they were joined by Chameleon, Scorpion, Shocker, and Rhino. This version was directly under Kingpin's thumb, enlisted to crush Spider-Man once and for all. Eventually, the Vulture would replace Mysterio, but the group never quite matched the raw menace of their comic book counterparts. Still, the Insidious Six episodes stood out for their high stakes and creative battles, showing Spider-Man facing not just one villain, but a coordinated multi-threat force. Even with the name change, the show made these episodes feel like a true event, giving fans a taste of the legendary team while navigating the tricky world of 90s cartoon censorship. How long did the show actually last on TV? When people think back to Spider-Man the Animated Series, they often remember certain arcs or villains, but not everyone realizes how long the show actually ran. From November 1994 to January 1998, it delivered 5 full seasons with a total of 65 episodes, which was a remarkable run for a superhero cartoon at that time. In fact, it became the longest-running Spider-Man cartoon until Ultimate Spider-Man challenged it years later. The decision to keep it going that long gave the writers the chance to structure the show more like a comic book, with interconnected storylines that stretched over multiple episodes. By Season 5, the series wasn't relying on standalone adventures anymore. Instead, it leaned heavily on multi-episode sagas like Six Forgotten Warriors and the massive Secret Wars arc. For Saturday morning television, this kind of serialized storytelling was rare. Kids were following an ongoing narrative that unfolded across months. That consistency and ambition are part of the reason the show still feels like a definitive Spider-Man adaptation for so many fans.
Where to now?
Face front, true believer. We are going to find the real Mary.
Why did the series end on such a cliffhanger? Most superhero cartoons tie up their endings with a neat bow, but Spider-Man the Animated Series did the opposite. Its finale left viewers dangling on one of the boldest cliffhangers in 90s animation. In the last episode, Spider-Man is traveling across dimensions with Madam Web in search of the real Mary Jane who has been missing. Just as the adventure seems to be ramping up into something huge, the screen fades to black. There was never a proper follow-up and fans were left with no closure. At the time, this wasn't the writer's intention. More episodes were planned, but behind-the-scenes changes at Marvel and budget restrictions forced the show to end abruptly. For decades, that open ending became a sort of legend among fans, with many assuming that they would never see a conclusion. But in 2025, Marvel finally stepped in to continue the story in comic book form with the Spider-Man 94 limited series. That project revisits the cartoon continuity and promises to give Peter and Mary Jane the resolution they were denied on television. It's proof of just how deeply that unfinished story stuck with people even 25 years later.
Get out of there!
who was behind Spider-Man's distinct voice? For many fans, when they picture Spidey in their heads, they also hear a very specific voice. That voice belonged to Christopher Daniel Barnes, who played Peter Parker across the show's entire run. His delivery carried a youthful energy that made Peter feel grounded and relatable, but it could also shift into something much darker during moments of stress or transformation. Barnes didn't just stop at playing the main hero either. When the show introduced alternate Spider-Men like Ben Reilly, the Scarlet Spider, or even the deranged Spider Carnage, he voiced them too, adding subtle differences to make each variation feel distinct. It's a range that gives the series a lot of depth without fans even realizing. And Barnes wasn't the only standout. The show also had Hank Azaria step in to voice Eddie Brock in Venom, especially during the Symbiote Saga, one of the most memorable arcs of the series. Together, these performances gave Spider-Man the animated series a vocal identity that stuck. Even decades later, fans often cite Barnes as the definitive animated Spider-Man, which says a lot about how much his work shaped the character's legacy in animation. What censorship rules shaped the series? Spider-Man, the animated series, aired on Fox Kids, and the network enforced some surprisingly strict rules. The most infamous was the no-punching policy. Heroes and villains could throw each other around, web someone up, or smash through walls, but a straight fist to the face was off limits. This forced animators and writers to get creative with action scenes, which is why Spidey relies so heavily on web tricks, flips, and acrobatics instead of brawling. Guns were another tricky area. If a firearm appeared, it couldn't resemble a real-world gun too closely, so a lot of the criminals ended up using futuristic laser blasters instead. Even Morbius the Living Vampire was changed because blood was a no-go. Instead of biting people, he drained their plasma through weird suction cups on his hands. For kids at the time, this didn't seem strange, but looking back, these workarounds show just how heavily censored the series really was. And yet, those very restrictions gave it a unique identity because the action sequences had to be as stylish and inventive as possible without crossing the lines set by censors. Which famous comic storyline almost made it into the show? The producers wanted to adapt one of Spider-Man's biggest 1990s sagas, the Clone Saga. At the time, the Clone Saga was dominating Marvel's comic line, introducing Ben Reilly and throwing Peter Parker's identity into chaos. The animated team actually started developing a version of the story for TV. Early drafts included Ben Reilly, Kane, and even ideas for multiple Spider-Men running around New York. The plan was to explore it across several episodes, but it never came to fruition. Network execs worried that the storyline was too confusing for younger audiences, especially since the comic version was already controversial and running long. Instead, the writers settled for a lighter nod to the concept. In the final season, fans did get to see multiple alternate Spider-Men during the Spider-Wars arc, including the Scarlet Spider, which acted as a kind of mini homage to the Clone Saga. While it wasn't the full adaptation, it gave fans a taste of what might have been, and it showed that the series was paying attention to major developments in the comics, even if it couldn't tackle them head-on.
Spider-Man, what are you doing?
Why did the show's animation look so different from other cartoons? Spider-Man, the animated series, had a very distinct look compared to other superhero shows of the 90s. Unlike the darker, moodier style of Batman the Animated Series, Spider-Man used brighter colors and sharp, almost comic book-like outlines. Part of the reason was the budget. The animation work was outsourced to several overseas studios, primarily in South Korea and Japan, which meant that the show had to strike a balance between cost and quality. The production team leaned on computer-assisted techniques for cityscapes and backgrounds, which was cutting edge for a cartoon in 1994. Those early computer graphics may look a little dated today, but at the time, they gave New York City a sense of scale and realism that stood out from other shows. The rooftop chases, web-swinging sequences, and skyline shots were ambitious for a Saturday morning series, even if they sometimes looked a little stiff. This visual style also gave Spider-Man a 90s feel, which we all love to this day.
I feel energy surging through me.
Which legendary horror actor lent his voice to a Spider-Man villain? One of the coolest bits of trivia about the series is that Michael Morbius, the living vampire, was voiced by Nick Jameson. Now, Jameson is a versatile actor who's known for lending his voice to many animated characters. By this time, he had already made his mark in horror circles for his work in eerie and spooky animated projects. His Morbius was unsettling in just the right way, leaning into a tortured, brooding quality that separated him from other villains. You could hear the desperation in his voice when Morbius wrestled with his hunger for plasma, a clever workaround for the censorship against blood. His performance gave Morbius more depth than just a one-note monster. For kids, it was probably their first taste of a tragic, horror-inspired character who wasn't all good or all bad. That kind of complexity was unusual for a Saturday morning cartoon. Jameson's delivery helped make Morbius one of the most memorable additions to Spider-Man's rogue gallery, and it proved that even in a censored show, atmosphere and voice acting could elevate a character into something unforgettable. Who else from the Marvel Universe made a surprise appearance? The series wasn't just about Spider-Man fighting his own villains. The creators used the stage as a playground to sneak in guest appearances from across the Marvel Universe. Characters like Doctor Strange, Captain America, and even the Fantastic Four popped up over the years. Doctor Strange's appearance in Season 3 is especially notable because it introduced mystical elements into a story that usually stayed grounded in science fiction. Strange helped Spidey face Baron Mordo and Dormammu, villains who might have felt completely out of place in another context, but here they expanded the scope of the series in a way that made it feel bigger than just one hero's story. These cameos also served as many kids' first exposure to Marvel characters outside the Spider-Man bubble. Long before the MCU trained us to expect crossovers, Spider-Man the Animated Series was quietly building the idea that Marvel's heroes lived in the same world. It felt special, almost like discovering hidden chapters of a larger universe.
I'm looking for some guy named Stan Lee.
What?
Why did Stan Lee himself show up in the finale? Perhaps the most surprising cameo of all comes in the very last episode. After all the multiverse hopping and the build-up to Spider-Wars, Spider-Man finds himself meeting none other than Stan Lee. Yup, the co-creator of Spider-Man makes a full animated appearance, and Peter Parker gets to thank him directly for creating the character. For fans, this was more than just a fun Easter egg. It was one of the earliest examples of Stan Lee making a cameo in a Marvel adaptation, a trend that would later become a staple of the movies. The animated cameo also had a sense of closure. Even though the show ended on a cliffhanger, this moment gave Peter and the audience a rare chance to step outside the action and acknowledge Spider-Man's legacy. Lee's warm, enthusiastic presence reminded viewers that behind the costumes, villains, and action, there was a man who dreamed up this world.
No! Get your hands off me! Let go, you fool!
Which former Spider-Man actors return? There's a neat connection between the animated series and Spider-Man's earlier live-action days. Nicholas Hammond, who played Peter Parker in the late 70s live-action Spider-Man TV show, didn't reprise his role directly, but fans noticed that his version inspired aspects of the cartoon Peter Parker's design and demeanor. However, another direct link came with Michael Bell, who had voiced Peter in earlier 80s animated shows, coming back to lend voices to side characters in this series. It was a subtle way of bridging different eras of Spider-Man on screen. These casting callbacks gave longtime fans little Easter eggs, while also cementing the 90s series as part of a larger Spider-Man tradition. Even if kids didn't know it at the time, the creators were layering history into the show, giving Peter Parker a legacy that stretched across decades and formats. It's details like these that made the animated show feel more connected to Spider-Man's long history than just about any other cartoon adaptation. How different were the international versions of the show? If you were watching Spider-Man the Animated Series in the United States, you weren't always seeing the same episodes as kids overseas. That's right. Certain international markets received altered cuts, sometimes with trimmed-down scenes and other times with noticeable edits to avoid cultural sensitivities. Violence was often the first thing to go. Any scene where characters fired guns, for instance, could be shortened or reframed, and some countries even swapped in digital laser blasts to soften the imagery. Dialogue sometimes shifted as well, particularly in European dubs where references to death or hell were swapped for lighter terms. While these changes might sound minor, they occasionally created entire continuity hiccups for viewers abroad, leaving storylines feeling disjointed or incomplete. For fans who later rewatched the original US broadcast versions on DVD or streaming, it could feel like they were watching a brand new show. This hidden patchwork of edits is one of the reasons nostalgia for the series varies slightly depending on where someone first saw it. The Spider-Man of London or Sydney wasn't always quite the same as the Spider-Man of New York City. Why did John Semper Jr. clash with Marvel executives? Behind the scenes, the show wasn't always the smooth operation it appeared to be. Producer and head writer John Semper Jr. had spoken openly about the constant push and pull between the creative team and Marvel executives, especially Avi Arad. Arad, who was in charge of Marvel's media branch at the time, wanted the cartoon to double as a marketing platform for toys and comic tie-ins. Semper, on the other hand, saw it as a chance to tell strong serialized stories and elevate Spider-Man on television. This tension led to heated disagreements about which characters could appear, how much violence was acceptable, and even how certain story arcs should be resolved. Semper has admitted that there were moments where he almost quit because of interference, but his persistence ultimately gave the series its distinct voice. Without his determination, the show might have just been another forgettable 90s cartoon. Instead, it became one of the definitive takes on Spider-Man. Which storyline was rejected for being too dark for the cartoon? One of the strangest restrictions placed on the writers involved Gwen Stacy. Semper and his team wanted to adapt her story, including her iconic death at the hands of the Green Goblin, but Fox and Marvel both felt the idea was too bleak for a Saturday morning audience. The imagery of Gwen being thrown from a bridge and Peter failing to save her was considered unworkable, not only because of the violence, but also because it hinged on death, a subject the network's censors kept strictly off limits. Instead, the writers leaned into Mary Jane as Peter's central love interest and steered clear of Gwen altogether, aside from alternate universe versions late in the show. Fans who grew up with the cartoon often didn't even know Gwen Stacy existed until they later discovered the comics. It's one of the clearest examples of how censorship and executive decisions shaped what the series could and couldn't tell. How did the cartoon shape Spider-Man's future on screen? For all of its behind-the-scenes struggles and censorship headaches, Spider-Man the animated series left a lasting legacy that went way beyond the 90s. Many of the storylines laid the groundwork for Spider-Man stories that would later appear in blockbuster films and other shows. The idea of a Spider-Verse, for instance, wasn't a mainstream concept until the cartoon pulled multiple Spider-Men together in its closing arc. Decades later, movies like Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and even No Way Home would play with the same idea, bringing alternate Spideys into the spotlight. John Semper Jr. has even pointed out that a lot of fans first met characters like Blade, Morbius, and Madam Web through his cartoon years before they became staples of Marvel's wider media universe. So, while it was just a Saturday morning show on paper, its fingerprints are still visible across Spider-Man's biggest on-screen adventures today. Marvelous verdict! Looking back, Spider-Man the animated series wasn't flawless. It was restricted by censors, caught in executive battles, and at times struggled with its own ambition, but maybe that's exactly why it worked. It pushed boundaries for what a kid's cartoon could do, and in the process, it gave us the Spider-Man we'd carry with us into our adulthood. Even now, its DNA shows up in modern films, games, and new animated projects. If you grew up with it, you know the mark it left. If you enjoyed revisiting this classic, don't forget to hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into the shows and characters you love, and let us know in the comments which Spider-Man moment from the series still sticks with you. Your pick might just make it into our next video. Otherwise, thanks for watching, stay safe out there, and have a marvelous day.